If you've been keeping up with the recent Nintendo Direct presentations that have been held, then you probably know about the upcoming title, Kirby and the Forgotten Land. It was announced in 2021 during a September Direct and caught everyone by surprise, not only for the fact that it's an entirely new Kirby game that came out of nowhere, but the style of the game is a first for the series as well. Aside from Kirby Air Ride, which is considered by some to be a spin-off title, Forgotten Land is the first Kirby game that's a 3D platformer, and breaks the traditional format of 2D platformers the series is known for. That was the first element of the game that I noticed, and it got me thinking about the time when Kirby attempted this style of gameplay years earlier, but it never saw the light of day. Not only that, but there are several other cancelled Kirby games that this one reminds me of, and honestly, this collection of lost media is something that I don't see get brought up a whole lot anymore. Back in the day, I used to obsess over cancelled video games and beta content, but nowadays, unless that game is Mario 64 or Zelda 64, you don't really hear too much about the other franchises at all. Today, I'd like to discuss the lost media and cancelled games related to the Kirby franchise, and relive some nostalgia as we look at the topics that have become well known within the world of cancelled Nintendo games. The first Kirby game I'd like to discuss is perhaps one of the most well known, and to me, is one of the most defining titles of cancelled games from the series. This one goes all the way back to the GameCube era, and lived in an era of mystery for several years before this iteration of the project was eventually cancelled. This game became known as Kirby Adventure, and made its debut at E3 2005, with several trailers and screenshots being available to give us a feel of what the game would be like. Here, the game appears to be a 2D platformer similar to previous Kirby games, albeit with 3D models more similar to Kirby 64, which was a comparison many people made at the time. There were also several gameplay elements depicted in these trailers, such as the ability to turn copy abilities into playable characters. 16 copy abilities were documented in the content that was released, including the addition of a new water ability, as well as an option for 4-player co-op, and a move that allowed Kirby to ride on the backs of the other players. Bosses were also included, and can be spotted from the trailer, which made the game look really promising, considering Kirby Air Ride had been the only Kirby title the GameCube received. However, during the time of its development, very little information about the game was given, and the game was even removed from Nintendo's website after a period of time. The title didn't make another appearance at the following year's E3, and questions began to circulate about whether or not the game was coming out at all. IGN claimed the game had moved development to the Wii, according to a list of upcoming titles found on Nintendo of Japan's website, while others believed the game had been replaced by Kirby Superstar Ultra on the DS. After several years of the game having vanished from upcoming title lists, including a notable exclusion from Nintendo Power, the game would eventually resurface 6 years later at E3 2011, announced as an upcoming Kirby game for the Wii, and retained many of the elements seen in Kirby Adventure, even appearing to use a similar game engine. This title was released a few months later as Kirby's Return to Dreamland, and plays pretty closely to how I'd imagine Kirby Adventure would have played. In an old Iwata Asks interview, it states that Kirby Adventure was cancelled due to the difficulty of creating a game that is both single-player and co-op, as well as admitting the game became shrouded in mystery once it disappeared after E3 2005. That's one of the coolest parts about this game, is that it so closely resembles the GameCube version we never got to play, so it's like we never really lost what could have been. In some of my previous videos, I've mentioned that I started collecting games a couple years ago, and even showed off some of my new favorites along the way. It's been really fun discovering series I either didn't know about or had no interest in playing before, and to date, I have the majority of major console releases beginning with the NES. However, there was one console in particular I never got around to buying, and that was an SNES, mostly for the fact that the games never really interested me as much as what could be played on other consoles. It wasn't until recently that I had a craving for some Super Mario World, and at long last, I had purchased myself a Super Famicom. I started looking through the library, figuring out which staple titles I wanted to play, and is when I was reminded of a really interesting Kirby game I saw years ago that never came out. If you're familiar with cancelled Super Nintendo games, you might have heard about this one before, which is called Kid Kirby. This game is pretty different from the majority of other Kirby entries in the series, and there's still quite a bit of mystery surrounding its development. The earliest documentation of Kid Kirby comes from a 1995 issue of the Mexican Club Nintendo magazine, and shortly after, promotional material advertising the game was scheduled to be available to retailers later that year. However, none of those plans followed through, and aside from these brief mentions, the game was nowhere to be found. It was cancelled after being in development for years, for what is described as a lack of progress, but also for how the Nintendo 64 was right around the corner at that point. It also would have utilized the unpopular SNES mouse peripheral, which added even more baggage to the game. The full plot and details of the game are not known, and were speculated to have never been fully developed, but we can see from the concept art that it involved a younger version of Kirby and his enemies. No gameplay has ever resurfaced either, and while a demo was produced, it has apparently vanished according to a developer of the game. This developer is also where all of the concept art and level layouts are sourced from, as they were posted online. The gameplay was said to be similar to Angry Birds, where the mouse was used to stretch, drag, and launch Kirby through the levels. While the concept of the game and designs of the characters are certainly interesting, I definitely don't think the game would have been a huge hit, so I can understand why it was cancelled, and don't feel like we missed out on too much by not being able to play it for ourselves. I do really like the character designs though, and I think it would be really cool if the idea of Kid Kirby was revived for a future Kirby game. The levels themselves are also really interesting to look at, especially from afar, with how much effort went into their design. And if it wasn't for the developer who posted all of this content, we'd have no idea it even existed. The next entry in the series of cancelled Kirby games brings us right in between the time period of Kid Kirby and Kirby Adventure, to the Nintendo 64 era of games. This particular era seems to be a fan favorite when it comes to games that were never released, and Kirby has a couple different entries for the console, the first of which is a sequel to Kirby Bowl on the Super Famicom, fittingly titled Kirby Bowl 64. The game was first shown off at the Shoshinkai trade show in November 1995, and was the first Kirby game developed for the system, as well as one of the first games shown off for the Nintendo 64 in general. Content involving this game during its initial announcement period was a little scarce, with the most well-known footage having come from the Shoshinkai event itself, as well as a few magazine articles, most notably GamePro, who claimed the game would release in April along with the Nintendo 64 console itself. When the console eventually did launch in June of that year, Kirby Bowl 64 was not present, and the game was never really heard from again, with no playable versions having ever surfaced, despite a playable demo that was available at Shoshinkai. However, in the gameplay footage that's available, we can see Kirby retains his round ball shape from the original game, and must be navigated through courses around enemies and to the exit of the level. There's also an interesting feature to take note of from this gameplay that shows Kirby on a surfboard, which is speculated to be a new ability in the game. Though what makes this so important isn't related to Kirby Bowl 64, but rather the next iteration of the game that came afterwards. While Kirby Bowl 64 was essentially cancelled, it's been said that the game was directly reworked into Kirby's Air Ride, and takes inspiration from this surfboard ability. This game is considered the precursor to the GameCube entry, and officially made its debut at E3 1996, though it apparently had a long development cycle. Several promotional videos were released while the game was still being developed, which show features of this entry not present in the GameCube iteration, including playable enemy characters. Despite the progress that had been made on the game, it was still rarely discussed after this event, and was even labeled as cancelled before the revival it received on the GameCube in 2003, when a new promotional video announcing it was released. While Kirby Bowl 64 never really took shape as originally planned, we did end up getting the game, eventually, as Kirby Air Ride. There are some claims that state the final build of City Trial was supposed to be bigger and more ambitious than what we ended up getting. This is only speculation, as there isn't a whole lot of content from Kirby's Air Ride available, and most of the game still remains a mystery. Let's take a break from Kirby games for a bit and talk about some lost media related to the anime adaptation. Kirby Right Back Atcha was the English dub of the series, which aired on the Fox Box and 4Kids TV in the early 2000s. It was a pretty popular show back then, and I remember watching it quite a bit with Sonic X, as they were often aired together. However, similar to many of the shows that 4Kids aired, they usually weren't broadcast more than once or given home media releases, which leaves room for lost media to happen, and Kirby Right Back Atcha was affected by this. There was one episode of the series which became a pretty big topic of interest several years ago, titled Shell Shocked, which first aired on June 11th, 2005. Though during this first airing, the entire episode didn't play in full, and was cut at the end by the baseball game that was being played that week. It's also been stated that the episode never even aired on some Fox affiliate stations, or were cut by baseball games in other markets as well. There was no way to get a recording of the full episode at that time, and it wouldn't be until a year later in 2006 when the episode was broadcast again, but this time in its entirety. Despite being re-aired, the rarity of the episode and lack of home media releases caused it to remain lost, as it couldn't be found in other re-uploads of the series that found their way online over the years. And just like all broadcasts that were never released on home media, the episode would only resurface if someone had found a VHS recording of it and uploaded that copy. Surprisingly, that did end up happening nearly a decade later, when in 2016, the episode was uploaded in full for the first time. While the original upload and even a promo for the episode have since been lost again, backups and re-uploads can be found, meaning the episode should hopefully never be lost again. And while this is the only major piece of Kirby Right Back Atcha lost media, there's a smaller example which is more of a curiosity than something you can actually find. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Game Boy Advance video series, which saw the release of a couple 4Kids shows, and while Kirby was not one of them, the series was originally planning to be released this way. There exists an advertisement from a 2003 licensing show of which 4Kids was planning to release Kirby onto the Game Boy Advance video series, which was called GBA TV at the time. Plans for its release were scheduled in late 2003, but didn't come out until mid-2004, without any episodes from Kirby. Here's a bit of an honorable mention title for the video, because while it does count as its own entry in the Kirby series, it's on the smaller side of lost games, and is quite similar to Kirby Bowl 64. One of the more obscure Kirby games that did release was Tilt and Tumble, a Game Boy Color title that uses tilt sensors in the cartridge to allow Kirby to roll in between levels in-game, as you tilt the handheld during gameplay. I've never played this exact title, but I have played Yoshi Topsy-Turvy, which is pretty similar in concept. But perhaps I would have had some experience with the Tilt and Tumble series if one of its cancelled entries had released, because I did own a GameCube and a Game Boy Advance, so I could have played this at the time. Kirby Tilt and Tumble 2 is a cancelled sequel to the Game Boy Color original, which would have utilized the same tilt sensing technology as the first game, however, implemented dual-screen gameplay by connecting the GBA to the GameCube with its adapter. The game was first shown at Space World 2001, and there's quite a lot of video footage that has survived over the years from this title. However, only 1 year later at E3 2002, development of the game was reworked and now excluded Kirby entirely in favor of more generic shapes and levels. This game became known as Roll-O-Rama, but would have utilized the same functionality between a tilt cartridge, the GameCube, and the connecting adapter. However, Roll-O-Rama eventually vanished as well, and nothing related to this concept was ever released, and it's not entirely known why that was the case. Information on the game is pretty scarce, but my best guess would be some kind of issue with the connectivity involved to play the game, both consoles, the game, and the adapter. This also wasn't the only cancelled GameCube title that required the use of outside resources to play, with Stage Debut being another notable example. My favorite entry in this video, and the inspiration for looking back at all these cancelled Kirby games in the first place, comes from a rather famous source, which has been circulating the internet for years, and it was a very long time ago when I first found out about the topic in the first place. Even back then, I was planning on covering it in a video, but never quite figured out how to do it justice. But now, with the release of Kirby and the Forgotten Land, it all comes back around. Previously, I had stated that Forgotten Land is the first 3D platformer in the series' history, which breaks the traditional format of 2D platformers the series is known for. While that's pretty groundbreaking in itself, it's not actually the first time Kirby tried to make the jump into 3D, and that failed attempt dates back to the 2000s. This information comes from an Iwata Asks interview with the team behind Kirby's Return to Dreamland on the Wii. During the interview, it was revealed that in the 11 years between the release of Kirby 64 and Return to Dreamland, there were 3 separate attempts to create a new main series Kirby title, which all had failed and were scrapped. The first one that's mentioned is a game we've already discussed here, Kirby Adventure on the GameCube, which would have been released soon after Air Ride according to Iwata. The third of these games is stated to be a 2D side-scroller that had a visual style similar to that of a pop-up book, with copy abilities that could be powered up. There isn't a lot known about this game, with only one screenshot provided, but it looks pretty similar to what Return to Dreamland eventually became. This one also moved development from the GameCube to the Wii, further proving that point. However, the most interesting and unfortunate cancellation to me was the second game in this list, which puts Kirby into a 3D environment that allowed for movement in all directions. It was stated that this game was an experiment with extremely challenging gameplay, but never reached the level of quality the development team had hoped for, so it was scrapped. Similar to the pop-up book title, this one only exists as a single image, but we can see how far back the level goes, lots of enemies in the foreground, and Kirby with his sword copy ability. It also appears as if the level is designed to be a grid, but it's unknown if this has anything to do with gameplay. I remember seeing this image years ago and having no idea that Kirby could have had a 3D platformer game, which is something I always wondered why Nintendo never wanted to make. However, it seems like they did want to make a game like that, but it just didn't come out the way they had hoped. And that's a cool conclusion to have reached after all these years. Not only that, but now that Forgotten Land exists at all, it feels like an homage to this old idea that was simply buried for all these years, and even reminds me a little bit of the Kirby Adventure on GameCube too. While I've never been a big Kirby fan, I have played a good handful of his games, and whenever I do play them, I quickly become addicted and have a good time, even though they're not the most difficult to play. Hopefully in the future, as Kirby continues to receive new entries in the series, more of these older concepts can be revived as faithfully as Forgotten Land revived the 3D platformer idea. And above all, I think it's really cool that Nintendo can keep their old ideas around for long enough to finally release them to the public. That way, even though the original vision of a game might never be released, the iteration that comes out after it still preserves that part, which makes it feel less like a piece of lost media. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to check out some of my other game-related lost media videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, Finn.